July 26, 1941. President Franklin Roosevelt signed an executive order freezing all Japanese assets in the United States. Britain followed immediately. The Dutch East Indies joined within hours. It seemed like a routine economic sanction, a diplomatic slap, the kind of thing governments do when they want to send a message without actually fighting. But this was different. This freeze meant something far more dangerous than anyone in Washington fully understood. Japan lost access to 3/4 of its overseas trade overnight. More importantly, Japan lost access to 88% of its imported oil. In 1939, all but 6% of Japan's oil supply came from imports, with roughly 80% coming from the United States alone. The oil that powered Japan's navy, the oil that fueled Japan's war machine in China, the oil that kept Japan's economy functioning, gone, cut off. With the stroke of a pen, Roosevelt had created what he called the noose around Japan's neck. Japan's oil reserves were sufficient to last 3 years at peacetime consumption rates. Only 18 months if Japan went to war. The clock started ticking on July 26th. Every day that passed brought Japan closer to the moment when their tanks would stop moving, when their ships would sit idle, when their aircraft would be grounded, when their entire military would become useless metal sitting in harbors and airfields. Japan had two choices: back down from its expansion in China and Southeast Asia, or go to war before the oil ran out. There was no third option. No middle ground, submit or fight. And Japan had already decided it would never submit. What happened next wasn't inevitable. It was the result of miscalculation, misunderstanding, and the brutal mathematics of oil consumption. The story of how an oil embargo forced Japan to attack Pearl Harbor reveals something fundamental about war. Resources matter more than courage. Logistics matter more than strategy. And sometimes, nations go to war not because they want to, but because they believe they have no other choice. The roots of Japan's oil crisis went back decades. Japan imported 90% of its oil, with domestic production limited to small fields in Niigata and Akita. It was a resource-poor island nation trying to compete with resource-rich empires. Britain controlled Middle Eastern oil. The United States controlled Latin American oil and the Panama Canal. The Dutch controlled the oil fields of the East Indies. Japan controlled nothing. That vulnerability drove Japanese strategy throughout the 1930s. They needed resources. They needed territory. They needed security. So they expanded. First into Manchuria in 1931, then into China in 1937. Each expansion was justified as necessary for Japan's survival. Each expansion brought more condemnation from the West, and each condemnation brought Japan closer to the moment when the West would cut off the resources Japan needed. The United States watched Japan's expansion with growing alarm. American interests in China were threatened. The open-door policy was being violated. Japanese aggression was destabilizing Asia, but America wasn't ready for war. Roosevelt had declared a Germany-first policy. Europe was the priority. The Pacific was secondary. So instead of military action, Roosevelt chose economic pressure. In January 1940, the United States ended its 1911 commercial treaty with Japan. In July 1940, Roosevelt restricted exports of aviation gasoline, steel, and scrap metal to Japan. Each restriction tightened the noose. Each sanction reduced Japan's options, but none of them stopped Japanese expansion. By 1941, Japan was only obtaining 60% of its oil from America, down from 80% before the invasion of China. The American sanctions were painful but not decisive. Japan could still function, still wage war, still expand. Then came July 1941. On July 2, 1941, an imperial conference met in Tokyo. Prime Minister Prince Fumimaro Konoe got straight to the point. Japan had to decide its next move immediately. The subject was the Southern Strategy, occupation of military bases in French Indochina. This would give Japan a position to strike at the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, British Singapore, and American Philippines. It was a gamble. Moving into southern Indochina would provoke the United States. Everyone knew it. But Japan's military leaders argued they had no choice. The war in China was consuming resources. The embargo was strangling their economy. They needed the resources of Southeast Asia, and they needed them before it was too late. On July 21st, Japan signed an agreement with Vichy France for bases in southern Indochina. 5 days later, Roosevelt froze Japanese assets. The freezing order not only restricted Japanese economic activity in the United States, but also affected Japanese trade with Latin America and Europe, because those transactions were settled through U.S. banks. On August 1st, the oil embargo became official. Japan's nightmare scenario had arrived. The noose was pulled tight. In Tokyo, military planners did the calculations. The Navy had been stockpiling oil since shortly after World War I, from 1925 through 1930. Part of the appropriations for naval construction were secretly diverted to oil purchases. By March 1941, Japan had stockpiled about 42.7 million barrels. It sounded like a lot. It wasn't. The Imperial Navy consumed oil at staggering rates. Capital ships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, all of them burning fuel constantly. Training exercises alone consumed thousands of barrels. Actual combat operations would burn through reserves even faster. The planners calculated they had perhaps 18 months before the military ran dry. 80 months to win a war against the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands. 80 months to secure the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. 18 months to achieve Japan's strategic objectives. Or 18 months until Japan's military became useless. The math was brutal and unavoidable. Every admiral understood it. Every general accepted it. Japan couldn't wait. Every day of delay meant another day closer to total vulnerability. If they were going to fight, they had to start soon. Before the oil ran out. Before America's industrial capacity overwhelmed them. Before the window closed forever. But here's what makes the Pearl Harbor attack even more remarkable. The man who planned it didn't want to do it. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet, opposed war with America. When asked by Prime Minister Konoye about the outcome of a war with the United States, Yamamoto made a prophetic statement. I shall run wild considerably for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second and third years. Yamamoto knew Japan couldn't win a long war. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial capacity. He knew what would happen once America mobilized. But Yamamoto also understood the oil crisis. If Japan was going to war, they needed to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet immediately. Give Japan time to seize the Dutch East Indies oil fields. Establish a defensive perimeter. Force America to fight across thousands of miles of ocean. Make the cost so high that America would negotiate peace. It was a desperate strategy, but it was the only strategy that had any chance of working. Yamamoto began planning the Pearl Harbor attack in January 1941. He faced immediate opposition from the Naval General Staff. They considered it too risky. Yamamoto threatened to resign. The Naval General Staff caved. Planning proceeded in absolute secrecy. At the time of the First Air Fleet's organization in April 1941, only 4 of its top-ranking staff were aware of the plan. The Naval General Staff itself wasn't informed until May. Throughout the summer, pilots trained. Ships prepared. Intelligence was gathered. Ensign Takeo Yoshikawa arrived in Hawaii posing as a diplomat. He toured Pearl Harbor repeatedly. He discovered that Sunday was the day when the most ships would be in harbor. He learned the patrol schedules. He mapped the defenses. All of this information flowed back to Tokyo. In Washington, Roosevelt and his advisors watched Japan's military preparations with growing concern. They knew something was coming. American intelligence had broken Japan's diplomatic codes. They could read Japanese communications. But intelligence and understanding are different things. Washington assumed Japan would strike south toward the Dutch East Indies or British Malaya. That's where the oil was. That's where Japan needed to go. An attack on Pearl Harbor seemed strategically unnecessary. The Philippines, maybe. Hawaii? Too far. Too risky. Too ambitious. American commanders in Hawaii were warned that tensions were rising. They were told to be alert. But no one really expected Japan to attack Pearl Harbor. November 1941. Negotiations between Japan and the United States continued. Japan proposed withdrawing from southern Indochina if America lifted the oil embargo and stopped supporting China. On November 20th, Japan presented Proposal B, offering to withdraw forces from southern Indochina if the United States ended aid to China, froze military deployments in Southeast Asia, provided Japan with a required quantity of oil, and assisted Japan in acquiring materials from the Dutch East Indies. Washington considered a counteroffer: a monthly supply of fuel for civilian use, limited trade, just enough to keep negotiations going. Then everything changed. November 26, 1941. Secretary of State Cordell Hull delivered what became known as the Hull Note. The note demanded complete withdrawal of all Japanese troops from French Indochina and China. Japanese Prime Minister Tojo Hideki told his cabinet, "This is an ultimatum." To Japan's military leaders, the message was clear. America would not compromise, would not negotiate seriously, would not lift the embargo unless Japan abandoned everything it had fought for in China, abandoned its entire strategic position in Asia, returned to being a second-rate power dependent on Western goodwill for resources. That was unacceptable. Humiliating, impossible. The Hull Note ended any chance of peace. The strike force had already sailed. On November 26, 1941, 6 Japanese carriers departed Hitokepu Bay in the Kuril Islands, heading toward a position northwest of Hawaii. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. The same carriers that had dominated the Pacific for years, 408 aircraft. The most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled. They could be recalled if negotiations succeeded, but no one expected that anymore. An imperial conference on July 2, 1941, had confirmed the decision to attack Western powers. In early September, Emperor Hirohito declined to overrule the decision to go to war. Final authorization came on December 1st. By then, the strike force was already crossing the North Pacific. Radio silence. No transmissions. Complete secrecy. Heading toward Hawaii, toward Pearl Harbor. Toward a date that would live in infamy. December 7th, 1941, 7:55 a.m. local time. The first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over Pearl Harbor. 183 aircraft. Bombers. Torpedo planes. Fighters. They caught the American fleet completely unprepared. Sailors were eating breakfast. Officers were reading newspapers. Most of the fleet was in port. Exactly where Yamamoto's intelligence had predicted. The attack lasted less than 2 hours. Both waves. 353 Japanese aircraft total. When it ended, the Pacific Fleet was devastated. 8 battleships hit. Arizona sunk with over 1,000 sailors entombed. Oklahoma capsized. West Virginia and California sank in shallow water. Nevada beached after trying to escape. Pennsylvania damaged in dry dock. 188 aircraft destroyed. 2,403 Americans killed. 1,178 wounded. Japan's gamble had worked tactically. They had achieved complete surprise. They had crippled the Pacific Fleet's battleship force. They had bought time to seize the Dutch East Indies. But strategically, the attack was catastrophic. Japan had awakened the sleeping giant. The America that had been divided, isolationist, reluctant to fight, suddenly united with fury. Congress declared war the next day. The Netherlands East Indies oil fields produced 65 million barrels in 1940. Within months, Japan captured them. They captured British Malaya. They captured the Philippines. They seized the southern resource area exactly as planned. In 1942, the Japanese restored 25.9 million barrels of production. In 1943, 49.6 million barrels. With East Indies oil, Japan was able to import enough to make up for the American oil embargo. But Japan couldn't get the oil home. The Japanese tanker fleet was never adequate, and insufficient priority was given to building more tankers. Much of the Southeast Asia production never made it to Japan. Although production peaked at almost 4 million barrels a month in 1943, imports to Japan never exceeded about 1.4 million barrels a month. American submarines hunted Japanese tankers relentlessly. One by one, they were sunk. The oil Japan had gone to war to secure remained thousands of miles away, useless, unreachable. By 1944, Japan's oil situation was more desperate than it had been in 1941. The southern resource area oil fields were producing, but the oil wasn't reaching Japan. The Imperial Fleet, so mighty in December 1941, was forced to base major elements in Singapore instead of home waters, because there wasn't enough fuel to operate them near Japan. The irony was devastating. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor to secure oil. The attack brought America into the war. American submarines destroyed Japan's tanker fleet. Japan ended up with less oil than before the attack. The gamble failed. Yamamoto's prediction proved accurate. Japan ran wild for 6 months. Then came Midway, then Guadalcanal, then the long retreat. By 1945, Japan's cities were being firebombed. Its navy was destroyed. Its army was starving. And on August 6th and 9th, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15. The war that began over oil ended with nuclear weapons. The oil embargo of July 26, 1941, changed everything. It forced Japan into a war they couldn't win. It brought America into World War II fully committed. It ended American isolationism permanently. Before Pearl Harbor, America was divided. Isolationists controlled Congress. Neutrality laws prevented direct military aid. Roosevelt wanted to help Britain, but couldn't get authorization. Pearl Harbor changed all of that instantly. America mobilized completely. Industry converted to war production. Draft boards filled the ranks. Within months, American forces were fighting in North Africa. Within a year, they were invading Europe. The arsenal of democracy awakened. Japan's oil crisis didn't just cause Pearl Harbor. It reshaped the entire war. Without Pearl Harbor, America might have stayed neutral longer. Germany might have defeated the Soviet Union. Britain might have fallen. The entire outcome of World War II depended on events set in motion by an oil embargo. Roosevelt knew oil was the noose around Japan's neck. He pulled it tight. Japan tried to break free. And the result was a war that killed millions, reshaped the global order, and ended with America as the dominant world power. The lesson remains relevant today. Resources drive strategy. Nations go to war over what they need to survive. Japan needed oil. America controlled the supply. When Roosevelt cut off that supply, Japan calculated they had 18 months before their military became useless. 18 months to win or lose everything. They gambled. They struck Pearl Harbor. They seized the Dutch East Indies. They captured the resources they needed. But they couldn't hold them. American industrial power, once fully mobilized, overwhelmed Japan completely. The oil crisis that forced the attack on Pearl Harbor created the conditions for Japan's total defeat. And it transformed America from an isolationist nation reluctantly watching a distant war into the decisive power that won World War II and shaped the world that followed.